Welcome to the New Thinking for a New World podcast, where we explore the most pressing issues that are challenging and changing our societies. We are looking for new thinking and new solutions wherever we can find them. Listen as host Alan Stoga, the Thalberg Foundation's chairman, challenges his guests for analysis, ideas and actions. Together, we can help make our world at least a bit better.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has settled into a grueling, vicious war of attrition. Since both sides still seem to believe they can win, there is no end in sight. At the same time, there is a growing consensus in NATO capitals that long war not only favors Russia, but has the potential for some nasty unintended consequences. What does not seem to exist in NATO capitals is a strategy to do something about it. Tactics galore. Send more weapons, impose more sanctions, threaten the Chinese, cheer Zelensky's Churchillian speeches. But to find an endgame, missing in action. Which leaves Russia and its Chinese sponsor in the driver's seat for the war and perhaps for the diplomacy. Anna Wieslander is a Swedish defense and security expert who is, among other things, director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council. She has had the temerity to point out that the emperor has no clothes, or more to the point, no strategy. So today we're going to talk about what it might take to end this war, one way or the other, and some of those unintended consequences. Welcome, Anna, and thanks for joining Thalberg's New Thinking for a New World.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Let's start with something you published recently. You wrote that, quote, fear rather than courage still dominates among Western leaders, unquote. Please explain.
Well, it was one of the conclusions that I drew having listened to world leaders at the Munich Security Conference, the big security conference that runs in February every year. I was there last year as well. That was just a few days before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And there were a lot of bold words at that time, but no bold action. A lot of things have happened since, but I had expected much more where we are at the moment with the war in Ukraine, given Western unity that, we have to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. That's one of the rhetoric. Ukraine will win and all of this. But I was still, and I am still lacking bold actions and a strategy ahead to kind of make sure that this is what will happen in the future.
So you talked about, as I said, fear rather than courage, and had some very specific ideas in mind. What do these leaders fear? Well,
I think they fear along 4 dimensions as I see it. And the first fear is the fear of escalation. And connected to this is the big debate that we have had in the West on which kind of arms to send to Ukraine. And there is a fear that just the mere signal that we would send this or this weapon system, take for instance jet fighters or the tanks, will cause Russia to escalate the situation. And among those fears are, of course, the American fear of a nuclear escalation, which Russia has threatened with a couple of times during this conflict already. But then there is the more hidden fear, which you can sense, for instance, in Berlin, but I would say perhaps challenge a bit, and that you can find it in Washington as well. And that is, if we send all kinds of weapon systems and weapon systems that could reach into Russia, can we trust the Ukrainians that they will do this in a responsible way, or will their actions lead to an escalation that the West then will have to handle? So it's an escalation risk in 2 dimensions, I think. One dimension is mere signaling, and the other dimension is what if something would really happen, and can we trust the Ukrainians in this regard? And then, so that is one fear, and that has dominated a lot of the discussion, and it has led to a complete lack of strategy, I think, I would argue, when it comes to what kind of weapon systems would we deliver. I usually take this analogy with Sweden. If Sweden were attacked by Russia, we would be non-aligned as well, as it looks now at least. And the West would unite and say, we will support you, we will stand by you for as long as it takes. But, you are not allowed to use your jet fighters. And you're not allowed to use your long-range missile systems to hit back. And we will not provide you with anything like it. So how well can you actually fight back? And do you really support a country the way you say you do when you give this when you tie the hands to the back? So we need to, I think, to discuss this much more openly. Secondly, I would say there is a fear of having Ukraine in the European family, as we call it. So this was a rhetoric that was heard a lot in Munich, that not least from the EU side, where Ukraine has gotten a fast track for the candidacy status, and that Ukraine is part of the European family. And you can hear similar kind of phrases in the NATO context as well. But when you really scratch on the surface, there is, I think, a lot of hesitation and no real roadmap on how to proceed on this, because there needs to be changes in the rule of law and levels of corruption. Ukraine, who is pushing for a quick accession process, realizes this as well. But there is no clear, honest debate in Europe on how to do this. There were various propositions there. You can include Ukraine and then work on things, or how to do this. I think there is a lack of honesty, and when it comes to NATO, I think there is an open door policy, but really to include Ukraine quickly, if there would be a necessity for that, we are not ready for that discussion at all, and you could not hear it. So that's another big fear of really letting Ukraine into the European family, so to say.
So there's two fears: fear of escalation, and in a sense, fear of Ukraine. Fear of Ukraine's success. We'll come back to that, but put air quotes on the word success. What are the other two fears that you worry about?
Then there is fear, and this kind of divides Europe a bit. There is a fear of a defeated Russia. And that has to do, not least, you can hear it from French President Macron, who has said that on several occasions, that, Russia, of course, needs to be defeated in Ukraine. He doesn't want to see a Russian win in Ukraine, but Russia cannot be crushed. And this kind of goes back a little bit to the European concert thinking in Europe, I would say, where you have some kind of implicit balance, as you did in the 19th, early 20th century, between the great powers of Europe and, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Russia would be included in that. And if you have too much of a defeated regional power, that power risks coming back in a revanchist mood, as did Germany after World War I, for instance, is a common analogy. And that's not only France. You can hear that kind of thinking on continental Europe, but you don't really say it. So you say that, these kind of nuances that needs to be defeated or not crushed. And when you compare that to the fourth fear that I recognized, and that is the quite opposite fear, and that's the fear of a defeated Ukraine, which is the other camp, you can say, the more eastern camp in Europe, those countries with a historical experience of Russia or the Soviet Union, and how Russia and or the Soviet Union occupied territory in the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, Poland, and so on. And there, of course, there is a fear that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, Russia will only have appetite for more and be encouraged to continue this aggressive expansion of its sphere of interest, and that they might be the next targets. So that these two are almost opposite fears, but they need to be dealt with within our common European frameworks, and that's a challenge.
I want to come back to some of the specifics that you referenced, but first to put it in context. During the Second World War, the big three met regularly to define war aims, to agree on strategy. No one else had much of a say. The French weren't there. No one was there. But today, the West seems to suffer, at least with regard to decision-making, from a surfeit of democracy. Too many countries, too many leaders, some with as you've just suggested, some with fundamentally opposed views and perhaps interests, all of them in the room, in a sense. Is this any way to fight a war?
Well, it's a difficult question because, of course, you have to. We are democracies, and we have to acknowledge public opinion in this regard, and that brings a kind of I think both a hesitation and also a short-term perspective to the issues that becomes problematic, because the politicians tend to look at the next opinion polls all the time, and how you overcome it. I think it really requires political leadership, and you can hear these kind of discussions as well, but not perhaps among the most leading countries. But for instance, Prime Minister Kallas of Estonia, I think, has been a clear voice on this. That you need to have this kind of dialogue with others. I've been in panels with also, Greek defense minister. Others would acknowledge that we need to have a persistent conversation with the public on why we need to sustain Ukraine and why this needs to be stopped. But yes.
But I'm less worried about the public and more worried about the absence of a decision-making framework. I understand that the leaders of the Baltics, who are on the front line, after all, have very strong views and they fall into the camp you described earlier of the most aggressive solutions. But I could imagine those meetings at NATO Council and elsewhere going on for years because everybody has a vote, and you can't make decisions in that kind of circumstance. I don't think you do need leadership, but the process doesn't allow for leadership to evolve. How do you get a consensus? A consensus strategy, almost by definition, is an oxymoron. That's provocative. But.
Yes, I mean, a few reflections on that. I think, what has surprised you mentioned it as well before, but Ukraine surprised us. I think Ukraine has been conducting a leadership in a very interesting way, addressing parliaments and others and challenging the West from the start, actually, on what to do and why we haven't done more. So without that kind of spark and fire from Kiev, I don't think we would have been where we are today either. The second component, which is absolutely needed for some kind of decision-making here, has been the U.S. engagement in this conflict. And that is for all Europeans to see. We have had a long, many years of discussions on European independence, strategic autonomy within Europe. Especially, I think, during the Trump years, this blossomed. When there was both a feeling that perhaps the U.S. interest in Europe was not that big, and there were also disagreements on how to move forward politically, not least. But that has changed with, I think, the Biden administration has been very much engaged. So that's a necessity. Is it enough, as you suggest? Apparently no, because the strategy is still not there, and I think we need to put some more. How can you phrase it? We need to put some more challenging questions on the table. For instance, what is the what is the future order when it comes to Russia, for instance? Will it even be possible to have Russia included in the European security architecture? Or do we need to take some bold steps there? The problem, I think, is that still I do not. I've been talking about this a lot with the Europeans. Could the EU, with only now France and Germany as the engines, as the UK have left, could they, pursue such a path where you actually not break with Russia, but put Russia kind of on the side of the core of Europe, and you have structures where you balance against Russia, and then from there on you have contacts with Russia, rather than the way we built it after the Cold War was to create all European structures where actually Russia would be included everywhere. OSCE is still built like that, and basically this just has fallen apart without us really taking the consequences of it. Well, I think the answer to that question is no. I don't think that Germany and France will be able to pursue such a path because of this underlying idea that you always have among those countries that perhaps best described by saying that, if Russia is excluded, it would also in a way reflect the decreased kind of power of France and Germany, because if you define yourself as all regional European powers, Russia kind of needs to be there in a way in order to also bring status to France and Germany. You can see it in their in the way they want to talk to Putin. Everyone wants to call. You could ask, why doesn't one person call him? But this is the dynamic of the European politics. And therefore, I land in, I come back to the United States as still a very important voice for Europe to come together. And the UK cannot bring it either. It's not influential enough.
Do you know leaders that sound like these? Leaders, young or old, who are changing the world? Who are not content with what is and are willing to work for what could be? If so, nominate them for the Talberg SNF Eliasson Global Leadership Prize at talbergprize.org. That's TALLBERG prize.org.
Although it's clear the Americans don't have an answer to the endgame question either, or at least they haven't. If they have one, they haven't shared it. But let's talk a little bit more about consequences. I've recently heard chatter both from very senior German diplomats as well as from American general officers that one of the consequences of this war, however it eventually ends, is that Ukraine may end up with the largest, best outfitted, most dynamic army in Western Europe, including with its own defense industry, if some of these initiatives on the investment side actually occur. And that the real security guarantee structure for a post-war Europe, at least in this front, is that Ukraine becomes the bedrock of Western security facing the Russians. And secondly, if that happens, then a kind of natural alliance between the Poles and the Ukrainians evolve, where you combine two really quite large countries, maybe both in the EU at some point, if not in NATO, but a lot of power, a lot of people, a rebuilt Ukrainian economy. I'm a decade out now or something. And Poland and Lithuania and the rest of the Balts and Ukraine become the opposite pole to the French and German pole, if you will, in a new Europe. Does that make any sense to you? Would it be a good development if it happened that way?
It needs to be a powerful Ukraine in order to balance Russia that closely. I mean, either Ukraine will be eaten by Russia, or we need to boost Ukraine in order to withstand Russia. And because Ukraine, the time where Ukraine, was a de facto kind of buffer state in a way, that its status was left up in the air to the comfort of Europe, which, I mean, we had all these kind of question marks regarding Ukraine, as we discussed before. I think that period is definitely over, and it's not only Ukraine. There will also be Moldova. We will have to deal with Georgia if it's not too late, and parts of the Balkans as well. And that means that it needs to be boosted from within. You can look at the way Finland built itself after the end of World War II, for instance. Now they had a special pact with the Soviet Union, but still they had sovereignty, even though little space of maneuver. But they built themselves strong military and prosperity from within, and also solidify their democratic institutions. So I think this kind of this, no matter what else we can do, we can always, I think, support this if it's left like this, and that's the only way forward. But I would also think that we will have to face the institutional discussions, both when it comes to EU and perhaps NATO. I mean, the only option would be for the US to give bilateral security guarantees. Perhaps the US wants to do that with a special solution for Ukraine, but otherwise we need to start thinking about the NATO enlargement process as well for Ukraine.
NATO enlargement is on the table because of the Swedish and Finnish applications. The Finnish application is now going ahead. Sweden's application is held up by the Turks. I want to talk about Turkey in a second. Do you see, however, any resolution, near-term resolution for Sweden's membership? And does formal membership matter as much as it might have in the past? I have the impression there's a lot of work going on at the moment, as though Sweden is already a member of NATO.
Well, I believe that there is, of course, in the short term, now that we have this split or shift of strategy, you might call it, Sweden and Finland applied together and wanted to join NATO together. If Finland now goes ahead and the ratifications occur in Turkey and Hungary, as they have indicated before Sweden, in the short term, if it's a matter of months, it doesn't make that much of a difference. But because both are invitees, and we are invitees at a already quite integrated level, you can say, because we were closest partners to NATO, both Sweden and Finland before, and there had been highly, we were interoperable, we had exercised, we had planned, and we had even some plug-in mechanisms connected to the graduate response planning already. And as invitees, this work has proceeded even further, and both Sweden and Finland now have interim NATO defense planning targets, for instance. So this would, of course, proceed, this work, as it looks, but I think, on the other hand, there is a lot of energy and political will to that both Sweden and Finland should be members by the Vilnius summit in mid-July. And there are very good reasons for having it like that, because the way NATO is now shifting even stronger towards deterrence and defense, the way it's implementing its new force structure, its new force model, how it generates its planning, and how it prepares to kind of solidify NATO territory in light of Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. That also would be suboptimal if Sweden does not become a full member. So in that sense, there is a sense of urgency, awareness, and I think that allies, they're already, 28 out of 30 allies, if you turn this around, have already ratified and believe that Sweden is as good a member as Finland. and that there is nothing more to do in that. In their light, Sweden is already a NATO ally. So I think also there is need to move forward on this. Otherwise, NATO NATO appears weaker. It becomes also risks of being more fragmented, having more problems of solving certain things that needs to be solved when it comes to defense planning and deterrence, and also, I would argue, resilience.
I agree with all that, but it implicitly raises the question whether or not NATO might be better off with Sweden and Finland and without Turkey. I know that's heresy. I know that the NATO planners would be unhappy even to see it discussed. But Erdogan, and it's not just Erdogan's Turkey, but Turkey has been, one could make the argument, much more of a liability than an asset for a long time. Could one of the possibilities that comes out of this mess be that everyone stands up and says, Turkey, you either play by our rules or you leave? It's that simple.
Yes, I mean, Turkey is, of course, as you say, for the NATO defense planning, an important player. And now with the war in Ukraine, also with the grain deal, its role there, its possible role as a negotiator with Russia and so on. Its position by the Black Sea. So that is on one hand. On the other hand, there are I have not heard as many reactions on Turkey and various experts raising the possibility of having Turkey leaving NATO as I've heard now. I don't see it coming in a realistic way, but I think also it's up to. I mean, the interesting question for me here is, what is Turkey's end game in all of this? It has been connected to the Kurds. It has been connected to domestic policies that Erdogan has some kind of win in this. But as this behavior continues, if it continues to weaken NATO, and it creates this wedge that only basically Russia profits from, since it's a fragmented, weakened NATO, and you have Hungary as well with its close ties to Russia, then of course also the most difficult questions needs to be asked around this.
Let's just for a second move to the far north. I know you've done a lot of thinking and work on security in the Arctic, and that is the other space or another space where present, certainly future confrontation with Russia is entirely possible. The Russians have enormous resources deployed up there. The West somewhat less so. It goes back perhaps to your question, it goes back perhaps to your observation earlier that there is this question of how to engage with or confront Russia after this war. The assumption underlying most of the policies in the high north was that we'd all work together on the Arctic. Is that still possible in a world that has been ripped up by this war?
Well, the Arctic is special, as you say. I mean, there has always been this, or there has been for long ambition to have low tensions in the Arctic, and to be able to work together, those Arctic countries. And since Russia is the biggest Arctic country, there are, of course, good reasons for that when it comes to search and rescue and the sea lanes of communication and all of that. As it is now, I think this will still be the ambition. But what I have argued for is that we also must be aware that we have to cooperate from a position of strength, and that goes also for the Nordic, for the Arctic. You have the Kola Peninsula, where Russia has a majority of its second strike capabilities, which is very important for Russia. You can also see if when Sweden and Finland join NATO, the Baltic Sea will be more of NATO territory. So for Russia, I think they will strategically put even more emphasis perhaps on the Kola Peninsula compared to Kaliningrad, which will be kind of an enclave that is really surrounded by NATO. So we need to think about it up there without, of course, creating more tensions. But if you do it from a defensive denial position, then I think there could be perhaps prospects for détente further on, as we also perhaps we hopefully see some kind of solution to Russia's war in Ukraine. But there definitely needs to be much more attention paid to what's going on in the Arctic, because you also have what we follow closely now, but we're not, it's hard to assess in detail, but the Chinese-Russia kind of alignment that is shaping the partnership without limits, as they say. This also plays out in the Arctic. So that's one of the areas where Europe might notice this the most, actually, apart from any possible kind of engagement from China in the conflict between Russia or Russia's war in Ukraine. Because the Chinese are much more engaged up in the Arctic, but they're also, to some extent, dependent on Russia, because China is not an Arctic state. So China has no territorial claims up there. They need to cooperate with actors up in the Arctic in order to secure their foothold up there. And then Russia is, of course, a very important partner for them.
And presumably all of this makes NATO membership even more important in terms of Sweden and Finland as we think more and more in the future about the Arctic and how to cope with the Russians up there. Let me end, though, with a totally unfair question. The war is more than a year old. Do you think we'll still be fighting it a year from now in your heart of hearts?
Yes, I think so. I wish I would. I wish I didn't. But I think we need to be mentally, how hard ever it is, and we would hope for some kind of, now that the West provides these more advanced weapons, that there would be some kind of dynamic for the Ukrainians moving forward. There might be, and perhaps that could leave some space for negotiations and so on. But I do not think that the war will be over in that way in one year. I don't think so. No.
Let's leave it there. Thank you very much, Anna Wieslander, for joining us on this podcast. I wish we had more positive things to talk about and a better outlook, but realism matters at moments like this. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Please rate our show on Apple Podcast and subscribe. Meanwhile, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter at tallbergfoundation.org to learn more about our work. That's TALLBERG foundation.org. Thank you, and we'll be back again next week for another episode of Tallberg's New Thinking for a New World. This podcast was brought to you through the generous support of SNF, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.